So here, see what I'm putting here? This is a set of survey questions that was asked in, I think, the early 90s when a guy named Dennis Hastert was Speaker of the House. And so the question was, we want to know how much information people have about public figures. So can you tell us about these names? The first name is Dennis Hastert. What job or political office does he now hold? And he was at the time Speaker of the House, and 10% got that right. So that gives you an idea there. Okay, so who's the vice president right
Kamala.
now? Okay, so in whenever this was in the 2000s, 75% got that. So you're in the upper 75%. We don't know how much higher than that you might be. In other words, you're not in the bottom 25. 25 didn't even know who the vice president was. So there's okay. So if which party is more in favor of abortion, women's right to abortion?
The Democratic Party.
Yeah. Okay. So only about half know that, or knew that earlier on. So you're getting the idea that there's a lot of variability out there. Which of the parties is more conservative at the national level?
The Republican Party.
Yeah, so that was 69%, but 30% didn't know that, and 16% said the Democrats were more conservative, so they were probably guessing.
Interesting.
And so probably 16% of the people who said Republicans were more conservative were guessing correctly. So maybe it's around 50% know the Republican Party is more conservative. Okay, so to give you an idea of who's more informed, this little thing here down here, imagine that there's a 100-point scale going from zero information to everything, all 9 members of the Supreme Court. So a scale going from 0 to 100. And these things here show how many points on that scale you move for each of these things. So for going to graduate school versus grade school, that's a 39-point difference on that scale. Okay, so being 90 years old versus 18 is 25 points. So older people are better informed just with being out there longer. They figure it out and gradually pay more attention. And okay, so gender, 9 points for being a male, 4 points for going to church, which is basically measurement there, randomness, nothing for that really. Black versus other, nothing. Union versus other, nothing. But age, education, and income is a little effect. Gender, top 5% versus bottom 5%. So that's a big difference. But it doesn't make much difference, only 12 points. So older and better educated people know a lot more. So there's a wide variation, and it kind of makes both of those things kind of make sense.
Yeah, it follows.
Yeah, but it's something that when you talk about public opinion, you're talking about very many different kinds of people. Right. Some of whom are paying a lot of attention, and some of whom aren't. And this shows up in the way that people respond to questions. So this next one here, this is at the time of the Gulf War, and so people were asked, do you agree, this is the first question, do you agree or disagree that the United States should take all action necessary, including use of military force, to make sure that Iraq withdraws from Kuwait? So 69% says yes, use all available force. And then there's a series of questions, and I'll just go to the last one. All in all, which of these courses of action do you agree with? The U.S. should keep troops, planes, and ships in and around Saudi Arabia to protect it, as long as necessary to prevent Iraq from invading Saudi Arabia, but without initiating a war. Or the U.S. should initiate a war in Iraq to drive Iraq out of Kuwait and bring the situation to a close. 65%. So 69% said all available action. 65% says no war. And so the guy who was writing about this and a whole bunch of other questions, there's a quote from him at the bottom here, which I'll read. One might conclude from this array of results that at the time these polls were conducted, 28% of the population was willing to initiate a war, 38% was willing to go to war, 46% was willing to engage in combat, 65% was willing to use military force. So this is not typical. This is not completely typical. It is fairly typical of more abstract issues like foreign policy. So, a lot of these people who don't know who has, which party is more conservative, also, they have just no basis for an opinion on something like this. And this is at an extreme. So I want to show you one. So you get different questions, different responses, different, as your teacher would say, different positions on different issues, depending on question wording. Extreme differences on foreign policy and more abstract things, smaller ones on things like abortion and race, but still, some significant differences. Okay, so in Houston, there was a ballot initiative on affirmative action. And the referendum proposed to ban preferential hiring in city contracts. And the city council, and this was put on the ballot by conservatives, by a standard, that's a standard thing to do. The city council was controlled by liberals, and it changed the wording of the referendum as to a ban on affirmative action instead of a ban on preferential action, instead of a ban on preferential hiring. The reason was that preferential hiring sounds bad, and people would want to ban it. And affirmative action, a lot of people favor that. The legal meaning of the measure remained exactly the same under the two wordings, but they had reason to believe that one would pass and the other wouldn't. So a lot of people favor affirmative action, but don't seem to understand that it might involve something called preferential hiring. If people need to know the details, they might not have real opinions. They might just have general postures and not really know what they're in favor. The NRA and political groups play on this all the time. They try to talk about their issue in terms that sound good to their side. So women's right to choose versus pro-life, same thing,
Right.
and it makes it makes a difference. Okay, so now though, here's another thing though. A lot of people, if you ask the same people the same question at different points in time, they will give often randomly different responses. Just a lot of what's called response instability. So the question is, some people think the government should provide fewer services, even in such areas as health and education, in order to reduce spending. Other people feel that it's important for the government to provide many more services, even if it means an increase in spending. Where would you place yourself on this scale? And then for this particular survey, a person is handed, the interviewer, this is done face-to-face, not over the phone. They're given what's called a show card, which is this thing in a box down here. And so you're supposed to put yourself on a 7-point scale. They're really trying hard to make a good measurement, for people, thoughtful responses. So people give themselves these responses on a 1 to 7 scale. Okay, so you ask the question of the same people at 2 different times, and 22% of them give the same position set both times, 6, 6, 2, 2, whatever. And then another 32%, there's some change, but it's directionally stable. So they stay on the same side of the thing. So they're either 1, 2, or 3, or 5, 6, 7. And then they can also be stable in the middle. So if they give 3, 4, 5, that's also stable. So that's what directionally stable means. So that's 54% gave basically the same opinion. Then there's another group of people, 17%, who give opinions in both interviews, but directionally unstable. They change from one side to the other. And then there's another group of people who give no opinion in one interview and an opinion in the other. And then another group of people who give no opinion in either one. So there's 52% here, 54% here who basically have opinions, and the other half, it's questionable whether they actually have an opinion. They may have some ideas, and I'll say more about that in a second. But now here's a graph which is a little bit hard to read, but bear with me. So this is people on level of, each bar has to do with the level of information. So this one is lowest information. This is people who don't know who the vice president is.
Okay.
And this is people who get everything right. Okay, and the dark black means same scale position both times. So for the low information people, that's about 11%. And then down to here, this is 70. So 70 up to here. So 30% basically have opinions here. And the rest, maybe not. Among the high information people, it's like 80% have opinions.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the people who have higher information are more they're more concise about what they believe. They
know what they actually have beliefs.
Yeah, they really believe in something.
And it's on a question that's really at the heart of politics. And so when people were directionally unstable, I wanted this was one of the studies that kind of I was making my reputation on. People were asked the same question here at 2 different times, 6 weeks apart. And after they were asked the question the first time, like they say, I think there should be more government services, they say. And so then they were asked a follow-up question. What were you thinking about when you said that? And they would say something like, we need more services for that, for some reason. And then they would ask the same question the next week or 6 weeks later, and they were again asked, what were you thinking about when you said that? And so people would give different things that they were thinking about. So the very first time that I was this experiment, this study that I'm talking about was done on the phone, not in person. Uh, um, but I was on the phone listening in to the interviewers as they were asking this question. And so so for the very first respondent, I read what he said the first time, which was, he says, schools are just terrible in this country. We just have to do something about education. It's just really atrocious. We need more spending, he said. So I read that, and then the interviewer dials the person up and says, what do you, should government services be increased or decreased? He goes, decreased. And I'm going, what? and I'm waving at the interviewer like, it's the wrong guy. You made a mistake. And he says, taxes in this country are just incredible. We just like, they just never give you a break. We just have got to cut back government. It's just terrible. So the takeout from that is that guy did have opinions, but he just had different opinions. And he hadn't bothered to consolidate them or taken the trouble to consolidate them in terms of this dimension that is the dimension that we're fighting about.
A little bit of cognitive dissonance there, it seems like.
He had no idea that he was being inconsistent. These were both things that he thought. Taxes are too high and education needs help. And you could go like on that Iraq question. No, I don't want to get into a war. That would be terrible. We should not get into a war. And also, I think Saddam is a bad guy who shouldn't be allowed to get away with this. And those would be two thoughts that people would have.
Right.
And if they're very attentive to politics, they realize that they take the trouble to develop a consistent set of ideas and have then stable positions on this scale in terms of your guy's question positions. They have different underlying, you might say, attitudes that they fail to consolidate into a stable position. So I say every opinion is the marriage of information and values and information. Values to determine a stance on the position object, and information to figure out what the relevant policy options and information is. And I argue that people go around collecting information, reasons to favor one side or the other, on a kind of a somewhat random basis. You hear, you pay your taxes, that makes you negative towards taxes. You might see a politician and you go, yeah, I hate taxes. Or you see a politician on television denouncing taxes, and you go, yeah, that's awful. And so you form what I call the consideration, which is a bad, taxes are bad. But then you go, your kids at school, you go to the principal tells you how underfunded they are. And so you form a consideration, schools need more money. And the average person kind of goes through life filling up their mind with these considerations that are inconsistent, but they're in there, and people they may or may not realize that they're inconsistent. And when they're asked a survey question, they kind of, whatever's at the top of their mind, that's what they say. If they've just seen a story about education, they say, yeah, I got more government services, and they don't realize about taxes. Or if they've just, if it's April 15th and they've just paid their taxes, then that's at the top of their mind. But then it's called receive, accept, sample. So the idea is that there are messages out there that people receive, but they may or may not accept them. The more attention they're paying, the less likely they are to accept something that contradicts with their liberalism or conservatism. So a sophisticated conservative will hear the liberal arguments, but reject them and fill up his mind with mostly conservative considerations, so that when he's asked a survey question, whatever's at the top of his mind will probably be the conservative position. But lower information people won't realize, hey, I'm hearing a liberal argument, I'm a conservative, or a Democratic argument, I'm a Republican. They just let it all in there. They collect a jumble of inconsistent considerations, and that leads to response instability. Also leads to more susceptibility to question wording effects, because the question wording will appeal, will bring one thing rather than another to the top of their head. For a sophisticated person, the question won't be able to prime something that's already in there. So that's the receive, accept, sample model. Okay, so this is global warming. And this is an issue. So it's here is across time. So and this has to do with news coverage of the global warming issue. And the red line is here. Let me start with the blue, the red line. The red line is, let's see, televised global warming stories that contain the word Democrat and Republican, or scientist and science. So these are the number of televised news stories on global warming that contain the word science or scientist across time. So early on, like there's not that much coverage, but it's mostly scientists talking about it. But later on, there gets to be more coverage, and it's like half politicians. So that, there's a lot of coverage, and it's very politicized. Okay, so here's a graph. This is a survey done in 1997. And this is liberals and conservatives. It's not information this time. That surveys didn't have information, but they had education. It's kind of the same thing. So if you look at liberals and conservatives as they get more educated, they really have no opinion on whether global warming is man-made. No difference of opinion.
Hmm.
It's just not politicized. But in 2009 and 10, there's that polarization pattern.
Mm,
So this is evidence of elites polarizing or leading public opinion,
right.
party elites. All of this is about elites guiding public opinion, but elites they're not the only source of it. And I'm going to say more than that. People have opinions. Well, I've already said people have opinions just because they have opinions. Like Black people, for example, are much more in favor of affirmative action than white people, and that's not because of elites.
Yeah.
Women. This was a kind of a neat study. Women don't differ that much from men in abortion. On abortion, more women favor abortion rights than women, but there are plenty of women who are conservative, on abortion. And the gender differences they're there, but they're not huge, and that might be surprising. But conservative women take what's called a conservative view on that. I think it's important to know this stuff, but I don't think that this is the stuff that drives politics. And I'm saying I think because I don't know, and I don't think anybody completely knows. But this is all of this stuff is from Nature and Origins, this early book that was this why I became well known and get paid a lot of money. But I became somewhat disillusioned with all this stuff. Again, it's important to know it and to always know it and have it always in mind. But I don't think that's what drives things. What I think drives things is something more like what's called identity politics. So what I was saying is that I don't think that people respond to politics in terms of particular positions and policies, but in terms of the group that they see themselves as part of and what or who is good for that group. They respond as members of groups. And different people have different identities. So ethnicity, Black, Hispanic, Asian, American, white are all identities. And a lot of white people don't think that they think of themselves as white, but they do. So people aren't, again, I've said this many times, aren't aware, at least of what I think they're thinking about. They don't maybe agree, you might say they don't agree with me on what their opinions are or why they have the opinions that they do. But I think I've got this evidence. But other groups that are important are religious identities, Christian conservatives, Christians. They think of themselves above all as Christians, and they're looking for the party that's good for Christians. That's the way I think much more public opinion is driven by people's sense of group identity and what's good for their group. And so conservatives would, if they would criticize me for saying that. They criticize liberals for being in favor of identity politics. And I have two responses for that. First of all, they do it as much as we do. They think of themselves as Christians or gun lovers or conservatives, or anti-libs. They have identities just as much. But secondly, I'm not saying that people should do this. I'm just observing that they do. And if you want to understand politics, I think it's a better way to do it.